It was supposed to be just another ordinary evening in the neighborhood. I had been invited to a small gathering at the clubhouse, the kind of event where people sip wine, nibble on cheese, and politely discuss the weather or the latest updates from the homeowners association. I didn't put too much thought into what I would wear. I had picked something I felt comfortable in: a well-loved blouse, a pair of jeans that fit just right, and shoes I could walk in without a second thought. It wasn't glamorous, but it was me. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I just wanted to enjoy a pleasant evening. When I arrived, the air buzzed with conversation. People stood in small clusters, balancing plates and drinks, and the smell of catered finger food wafted from the buffet table. I spotted a few familiar faces, exchanged some casual greetings, and began chatting with a neighbor about garden pests. It was relaxed, easygoing, exactly what I had expected. And then she entered. Everyone seemed to notice her at once, the way the room shifted slightly as she walked in, like a movie star stepping onto the red carpet. She was the kind of person who seemed to radiate money, not in a subtle way, but in an almost calculated display. From her diamond earrings that caught the light with every turn of her head, to her flawless manicure gripping a designer clutch, to the unmistakable logo of her dress, she was a walking advertisement for luxury. She had that air of someone used to being admired, even envied. I kept talking to my neighbor, pretending not to be aware of her presence, but out of the corner of my eye I noticed she was making her way around the room, greeting people one by one. Eventually, she reached me. Her gaze swept over me quickly, but not quickly enough to hide the micro-expression that flashed across her face, a faint narrowing of the eyes, a tiny twitch at the corner of her mouth. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Interesting outfit," she said, her tone dipped in honey but sharpened with steel. It wasn't loud, but it was just loud enough for the two people standing nearby to hear. And they did hear. I saw the slight widening of their eyes, the polite, awkward smiles, the way one of them sipped their drink to avoid saying anything. The comment hung in the air, feather-light and yet somehow crushing in its weight. For a split second, I felt my face flush. I laughed it off, the kind of small, brittle laugh you let out when you're trying to pretend something doesn't bother you. I made a joke about how I wasn't exactly a runway model and shifted the conversation towards safer topics. But deep inside, her words lodged themselves like a splinter. She hadn't just commented on my outfit, she had taken a shot at my confidence. She had made it clear that, in her eyes, I didn't measure up to her standard. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I kept smiling, kept chatting, kept eating little bites of cheese as if nothing had happened. But each time I caught sight of her across the room, laughing with someone, tossing her hair back, showing off her label like it was a badge of superiority, I felt that little splinter press deeper. When I got home that night, I replayed the moment in my head over and over. The way she had looked me up and down, the deliberate choice of the word "interesting," the slight tilt of her head as if she was giving me some kind of fashion critique I hadn't asked for. I knew it was just one comment, something that might have rolled off another person's back, but it clung to me. It wasn't about the outfit itself. It was about what it represented. To her, I was someone beneath her, someone who couldn't possibly understand the world of luxury, someone to be pitied or patronized. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. Instead, I felt something shift. It was a quiet, simmering feeling at first, one that curled deep in my chest and began to grow. It wasn't about proving her wrong for the sake of revenge, at least, not entirely. It was about proving something to myself. Her comment had opened a door I didn't even know was there, and through that door I could see a version of myself I had never considered before. I didn't know it yet, but that moment, standing in the middle of a well-lit clubhouse with a paper plate in my hand, being quietly mocked by a woman draped in designer fabric, would become a turning point. It was the kind of insult that doesn't fade quickly, the kind that lingers until it transforms into something else entirely. The morning after that party, I woke up with her words still circling in my head. They echoed between the moments of silence, popping up while I brushed my teeth, while I made coffee, while I tried to focus on my to-do list. It was ridiculous, I told myself. It was just a comment. Just two little words, interesting outfit. But the way she said it, the look in her eyes, the unspoken message tucked behind her polite smile, that was what made it impossible to let go. It wasn't only about what she had said. It was about how she had made me feel. Diminished. Judged. Dismissed. I kept thinking about the way I had stood there, holding my plate, pretending to laugh it off. I kept replaying the scene, imagining all the clever, cutting responses I could have said in the moment. But that ship had sailed, and all I was left with was the sting. It would have been easy to sulk about it, to retreat into the comfort of telling myself she was just a snob and that her opinion didn't matter. But somewhere deep inside, a different feeling was taking root. It wasn't anger exactly, and it wasn't humiliation either. It was something more focused, more deliberate. It was the spark of determination, the kind that starts small but carries a heat that refuses to burn out. I realized I didn't just want to prove her wrong. I wanted to prove to myself that her version of me, the one she saw and dismissed, wasn't the real one. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. She didn't know my story. She didn't know what I was capable of. She saw me in that one moment, in those clothes, in that setting, and she decided she had the right to define me. But I didn't have to accept her definition. I could create my own. That realization shifted something in me. It was like flipping a switch I didn't even know existed. As the day went on, I started to feel more awake, more alert. Her comment had cracked something open, and now I could see a challenge where before I had only seen a wound. I didn't want to just move past it, I wanted to use it. I wanted to take that insult and turn it into something tangible, something I could hold in my hands. It wasn't about the outfit itself anymore. It was about what the outfit represented: confidence, self-worth, and a refusal to be underestimated. I began thinking about the way she had worn her clothes that night. It wasn't just that they were expensive, it was the way she carried herself in them. The way she seemed certain that she belonged, that she was above the need for anyone's approval. I realized that confidence wasn't something sewn into a garment seams. It was something that came from within, and if I didn't have it, no label in the world could give it to me. But I also understood that symbols mattered. And maybe, just maybe, I could make that same label mean something entirely different for me than it did for her. That afternoon, while I folded laundry, I thought about all the times in my life someone had underestimated me. Teachers who assumed I wouldn't excel because I was quiet. Employers who thought I would settle for less because I didn't ask for more. Friends who assumed I couldn't handle challenges because I didn't broadcast my ambitions. And now, a neighbor who thought a single glance was enough to know my worth. In every one of those moments, I had eventually proven them wrong, but I had never done it consciously. This time, I wanted to do it on purpose. The more I reflected, the more I realized I had a choice. I could let her words bruise my pride and slowly fade, or I could treat them like fuel. I could let them push me into action, into a place where I was no longer reacting to her, but actively building something for myself. I wanted to feel that same sense of ownership she had when she walked into that room, but mine wouldn't come from borrowed confidence or unearned privilege. It would come from knowing I had worked for it, step by step, choice by choice. That decision settled into me like a stone at the bottom of a river, unmoving, steady, certain. I didn't tell anyone about it. I didn't make a grand declaration or start posting inspirational quotes online. It wasn't about putting on a show. It was about planting a seed, deep where no one could see it yet, and quietly deciding that it would grow. I didn't know much about designer fashion beyond the occasional glossy magazine cover I'd glance at in the checkout line, or the mannequins in department stores I never actually shopped in. Those price tags had always seemed like a foreign language to me, numbers so high they didn't even feel real. It was a world I had never stepped into, partly because it felt so far removed from my life, and partly because I didn't see the point in spending so much money on something I could find for a fraction of the cost. But now, something had shifted. It wasn't that I suddenly wanted to surround myself with luxury, it was that I wanted to understand it. I wanted to know exactly what made people like her treat these clothes as a badge of honor. I started small, just out of curiosity at first. Late at night, after I'd finished my work and chores, I would sit down with my laptop and search for the labels I had overheard her brag about at various gatherings. I read about their histories, the designers behind them, the craftsmanship that supposedly set them apart. I learned how certain stitches were done by hand, how rare fabrics were sourced, how some pieces took weeks to complete. The more I read, the more I realized there was an entire ecosystem built around these brands, an unspoken language of status, trends, and exclusivity. It wasn't just about fashion, it was about identity. I found myself fascinated by the way these labels marketed themselves, how they created desire not by making things more available, but by making them harder to get. Limited editions, waitlists, seasonal drops, all of it designed to make ownership feel like an achievement. And for the people who wore them, it seemed to become part of their personality. That was what had struck me about her the most, the way she wore her clothes as if they proved something about who she was. Once I had a grasp of the basics, I began exploring the practical side of things. I discovered resale platforms where people bought and sold pre-owned designer items, sometimes at a fraction of the original price. I learned how to spot authentic pieces from counterfeits by checking stitching patterns, hardware engravings, and authenticity cards. I read forums where collectors shared tips about finding hidden gems in thrift stores or outlet malls. It was like peeling back the curtain on a secret world I had never been invited into, except now I was walking right in on my own. I even visited a few high-end boutiques, just to see what it felt like. The first time, I was nervous. I expected the sales associates to size me up the same way she had, to decide instantly that I didn't belong there. But to my surprise, most of them were polite, even friendly. They let me browse, try things on, and ask questions. I could feel the difference in the materials, the weight of a well-made bag, the way a garment draped just right. It didn't make me fall in love with every single piece, but it did make me understand why some people valued them so much. At home, I started experimenting with my own style, mixing affordable pieces with a few small luxury accessories I had managed to find secondhand. It wasn't about copying her look, it was about creating my own. Every time I put something together that made me stand taller, that made me feel sharper and more put together, I felt a little closer to the version of myself I was building in my mind. I realized that learning about fashion wasn't just about clothes. It was about learning a new skill, one that combined history, art, business, and self-expression. I was developing an eye for quality, for detail, for things I would have completely overlooked before. It was a kind of education I hadn't expected to pursue, but it became part of my routine. I no longer saw luxury fashion as something reserved for people born into it. I saw it as something that could be understood, appreciated, and, with enough patience, acquired by anyone willing to learn the game. Bit by bit, I was demystifying the very world she had used to make me feel small. And with each new thing I learned, I felt that sense of distance between us shrinking, not because I was becoming her, but because I was stepping into my own power in a space I once thought was closed to me. Once I had learned the ins and outs of designer fashion, I knew knowledge alone wasn't enough. If I wanted to walk into a boutique and confidently buy the label she wore, I would need the means to do it. At first, that seemed like the biggest obstacle. I wasn't sitting on a secret pile of cash, and I wasn't willing to throw my financial stability into chaos just to make a point. If I was going to make this happen, it would have to be done deliberately, without debt, without guilt, and without sacrificing the things that actually mattered in my life. That meant finding a way to bring in extra income, something sustainable, something I could build alongside my existing responsibilities. The idea of building income streams was intimidating at first. I had always worked in fairly straightforward jobs where you traded your time for a paycheck, and the thought of doing something different made me hesitate. But the more I researched, the more I realized there were countless opportunities if I was willing to get creative. I started looking at my skills, my hobbies, and the things people often asked me for help with. I didn't have to reinvent myself overnight. I just had to identify areas where I could add value and turn them into something people would pay for. The first thing I tried was freelance work in my field. It wasn't glamorous, but it was familiar territory, and it allowed me to earn extra money without needing to learn everything from scratch. I took on small projects in the evenings, gradually building a list of repeat clients. The work was steady enough to make a difference, and I set up a separate account where every bit of that extra income went. That account became my designer fund, and I treated it as untouchable for anything else. At the same time, I explored other avenues. I sold unused items around the house, clothes I no longer wore, kitchen gadgets collecting dust, old electronics I had forgotten about. The first time I made a few $100s just from decluttering, it felt like I had unlocked a hidden resource I'd been ignoring. I also tried reselling finds from thrift stores, especially now that I had learned how to spot quality items. A few of those flips turned a surprisingly good profit, and I reinvested that money right back into my goal. Eventually, I started experimenting with digital income streams, small things at first, like selling templates and designs online. I learned as I went, making mistakes, adjusting my approach, and slowly building a modest but steady trickle of revenue. It wasn't instant riches, but it was progress, and progress was exactly what I needed. I became more disciplined with my spending too. I stopped buying impulsive items that didn't really add value to my life, and I redirected that money into my goal. It was amazing how quickly small sacrifices added up when they were intentional. Skipping takeout a couple of nights a week, waiting for sales instead of buying things full price, comparing prices before making a purchase. These weren't major lifestyle changes, but over time, they made a real difference. Every time I checked the balance of my designer fund, I felt a rush of satisfaction. It wasn't just about the number going up, it was about knowing that every dollar in that account represented effort, focus, and commitment. This wasn't money handed to me. It wasn't money from luck or a sudden windfall. It was money I had earned, little by little, through choices I had made on purpose. The process taught me a lot about patience. There were weeks when progress felt slow, when unexpected expenses ate into what I had managed to save, when I wondered if it was worth the effort. But each time I considered giving up, I reminded myself of why I had started. This wasn't just about buying a piece of clothing, it was about proving to myself that I could set a goal, stick to it, and make it happen without cutting corners. I began to notice a shift in my mindset. I stopped thinking of money as something that only flowed in from one predictable source and started seeing it as something I could actively grow in different ways. I realized that building income streams wasn't just a means to an end, it was a skill in itself, one that could be applied to any goal in the future. The more I embraced that, the more motivated I became to keep going, no matter how long it took. The day I finally walked into the boutique with the intention of making the purchase felt entirely different from the times I had gone there before just to browse. This time, I wasn't there to look, to learn, or to imagine. I was there because I had reached the point I had been working toward for months. The money was sitting in my designer fund, untouched except for the deposits I had made along the way, and I knew I could walk out of that store with the exact label she had worn that night. It wasn't about rushing in to grab the first thing I saw. It was about the experience of claiming something I had earned through every small decision, every extra hour of work, and every moment I had pushed myself not to give up. As I stepped through the glass doors, the familiar soft scent of perfume and leather greeted me. The boutique had the same pristine layout I remembered, perfectly lit displays, carefully spaced racks, and glass cases that turned accessories into treasures. A sales associate in a sharp black suit smiled and welcomed me. I felt a strange sense of calm as I returned the smile, knowing I was no longer just a window shopper. I was here with purpose, and that knowledge seemed to straighten my spine and steady my voice. I took my time walking through the store, letting my fingertips brush over the fabrics I had once only dared to touch cautiously. The textures told stories, silk that seemed to melt under my hand, wool so fine it felt almost weightless, leather with that unmistakable buttery smoothness. Every detail, from the stitching to the weight of the buttons, reminded me of everything I had learned over the past months. I wasn't just admiring beauty anymore. I was recognizing quality in a way I hadn't been able to before. When I found the piece, the exact designer label I had envisioned from the start, I paused for a moment, just looking at it. It wasn't locked away behind glass or elevated on a pedestal, but to me, it might as well have been. I thought about how that same label had once been a symbol of someone else's superiority, something used to make me feel small. Now, here it was, hanging in front of me, not as a reminder of her mockery, but as proof of my persistence. The sales associate approached and asked if I'd like to try it on. I followed them to the fitting room, and as I slipped it on, I noticed the way it fit, not just in size, but in presence. It felt like the culmination of every late night spent working on projects, every early morning sale I made online, Every moment, I had resisted the temptation to dip into my savings for something less meaningful. I studied myself in the mirror, not with vanity, but with a quiet acknowledgement that I had earned this moment. I didn't rush the decision. I walked around the boutique a bit more, made sure it was truly the piece I wanted, and then returned to the counter. As I handed over my card, I felt an almost electric satisfaction. It wasn't the rush of spending, it was the weight of knowing exactly what it had taken to get there. The transaction was quick, but for me, it carried the months of work and discipline behind it. The associate wrapped the item with care, placing it in a crisp, branded bag. I held it in my hands, and for a moment, I simply stood there, letting the reality of it settle in. This wasn't a splurge born out of impulse or envy. It was the result of a plan followed with intention from start to finish. Every obstacle along the way had been part of the process, and standing there, bag in hand, I understood that the value of what I was holding went far beyond its price tag. Walking out of the boutique, the air outside felt lighter somehow. The sounds of traffic, the chatter of people passing by, the warmth of the sun on my face, it all seemed sharper, clearer, like I was stepping into a version of my life that had been waiting for me to catch up to it. I didn't feel like someone playing dress-up in a world that wasn't mine. I felt like someone who had earned her place, not because of what she was carrying, but because of the journey it had taken to carry it. Owning that piece didn't magically change my life, but it did change the way I saw myself. For months, the label had been this distant, almost mythical thing, something tied to another person's arrogance and my own moment of embarrassment. Now, it was simply mine, and it carried none of the weight she had tried to attach to it. Instead, it carried the story of how I had gotten there, the quiet determination that had pushed me forward, and the proof that I could turn a small, sharp moment of humiliation into something entirely different. Every time I looked at it hanging in my closet, I didn't think about her smirk or the sound of her voice. I thought about the nights I stayed up working on projects, the thrift store hunts for resale finds, the discipline it took to pass on small indulgences so I could stay focused on the bigger goal. It became less about the label itself and more about what it represented in my own personal history. I realized that the real victory wasn't about matching her status symbol, it was about no longer needing her approval or feeling stung by her judgment. That was the lesson I hadn't anticipated when this all began. Self-worth can't be handed to you, bought for you, or taken away by anyone else. It has to be built, layer by layer, through the choices you make and the way you respond to challenges. I noticed subtle shifts in my confidence. I carried myself differently in social settings, not because I was trying to prove anything, but because I no longer felt like I had something to prove. If someone commented on what I was wearing, whether it was a compliment or a backhanded remark, it didn't stick to me the way it used to. I understood now that clothes were just clothes, but the mindset behind wearing them was everything. It also made me think about how often we let other people's words steer the course of our lives without even realizing it. That night in the clubhouse, I could have chosen to brush off her comment and never think about it again. But by letting it dig deep enough to spark action, I had turned it into something powerful. It reminded me that moments of discomfort are often the beginning of growth if you allow them to be. The sting doesn't have to be the ending, it can be the starting line. The process also reshaped how I viewed goals in general. Before, I would set vague intentions like save more money or be more confident, but those goals never had much staying power because they weren't tied to a specific vision. This time, I had something clear, something tangible I could picture in my mind down to the smallest details. That clarity made it easier to stay committed when the initial burst of motivation faded. It taught me that when you give your goals a concrete form, you also give yourself a clear path to reach them. Another lesson that stayed with me was the value of patience. In a world where we're constantly told to want things immediately, where next-day delivery and instant gratification are the norm, it felt almost rebellious to work toward something slowly, step by step, without cutting corners. There were times I wanted to just swipe my credit card and skip to the end, but I knew it wouldn't feel the same. The waiting, the planning, the small sacrifices, they were all part of what made the end result meaningful. And perhaps the most surprising part was how little I cared about what she might think now. In the beginning, my motivation had been tied to her, to the idea of standing in front of her one day and letting her see that I now owned the same label she had used to look down on me. But by the time I reached that point, her opinion had become irrelevant. The goal had stopped being about her a long time ago. It had become a private challenge between me and myself, a way of proving that I could take control of the narrative. I knew that the next time someone underestimated me or dismissed me, I wouldn't react the same way I did that night in the clubhouse. I wouldn't carry their judgment like a burden or let it seep into my sense of self. Instead, I would see it for what it was, a reflection of them, not of me, and decide whether it was worth turning into fuel. Because the real power wasn't in owning a label or proving a point. The real power was in knowing I could take any moment, no matter how small or stinging, and turn it into something entirely my own.